The prairie stretched far and endless, like God himself had spilled the earth without boundary. Rolling waves of grass caught the dying light of sunset, and the wind carried with it the sharp bite of dust and sage. In that vast silence, where coyotes cried and fences leaned tired against the land, one woman stood alone. Clara Dawson. Her hand rested on the curve of her belly, where life stirred gently inside her. The child shifted, as if reminding her it was still there, still waiting, still needing her to keep going. But her heart felt hollow. A month ago, she had buried her husband, Jacob Dawson, beneath the oak tree out back, fever stealing him in just 3 days. She'd wept until her body had no more tears, then she'd stood at the grave with nothing but debts, empty fields, and the cruel certainty that her child would never know its father's voice. The farm bore the mark of his absence. The barn leaned on rotted beams. The roof sagged. Chickens pecked half-heartedly in dry dust, and the fence posts tilted like soldiers wounded in battle. Jacob had always said this land would thrive one day. Without him, it looked ready to die. Clara sank onto the porch steps, her apron heavy with a folded letter from the bank. Another warning. Another reminder that the Dawson farm was slipping through her hands like water. She pressed her palm against her stomach. "What am I supposed to do, Jacob?" she whispered, her voice trembling in the quiet. In town, the whispers were worse. Dry Creek was a place where everyone knew everyone else's sorrow. Clara felt their eyes on her in the general store, at the post office, even in the church pews. Poor woman won't last the winter. She ought to sell and move east. No man's gonna marry her now, not with a baby coming. She had learned to keep her chin high, to pretend their words didn't burn. But at night, when the wind rattled the shutters and loneliness pressed heavy, she broke. Still, there was one man who never whispered. Daniel Holt. He lived 2 miles west, a solitary rancher with a reputation carved from silence. Broad-shouldered, sun-weathered, hands scarred from years of cattle and hard work. He wasn't a man of many words, but everyone knew he was steady. The kind of man whose handshake was as binding as law. Clara had noticed him long before her world fell apart. He always tipped his hat when their paths crossed. At market, he'd buy a sack of flour or apples from her stand, though she suspected he had little need for either. His eyes, steady, thoughtful, lingered longer than he meant them to. She had felt it, but she never let herself think beyond it. She'd been Jacob's wife, and Jacob was a good man. But since Jacob's death, Daniel seemed to hover at the edge of her life. Riding past the farm at dusk, never close enough to intrude, but close enough that she knew he was watching. More than once, she caught sight of him on horseback against the horizon, hat brim low, as though guarding her from a distance. That evening, as the sun dipped into purple, she heard it, hoofbeats. Clara rose slowly, brushing dust from her skirt. Her heart skipped. She knew before she saw. Daniel Holt reined in his horse near the gate, the leather creaking beneath his weight. He tipped his hat. "Evening, Clara." Her throat tightened. "Evening, Daniel." His eyes swept the place, the broken fence, the sagging barn, the tired woman before him. She braced herself for pity. But pity never came. "Fence looks like it's in repair," he said simply, swinging down from the saddle. His voice was calm, deep, steady as the earth itself. Clara let out a short, bitter laugh. "Everything needs repair." For a moment, silence stretched. The prairie wind whistled between them. Daniel took a step closer, his boots crunching the dirt. His gaze, firm but gentle, held hers. "If you need help, Clara, you know where my place is." The words hung there, plain but heavy. Clara swallowed hard. She wanted to tell him she was fine. She wanted to tell him she didn't need help. But the truth was written all around her, in the failing farm, the stack of bills, the way her hands trembled as she held them to her belly. She looked into his eyes, searching. And what she saw there was not judgment, not pity. It was something else. Something solid. But she couldn't let herself hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope had betrayed her before. So she forced a smile and nodded. "Thank you, Daniel." He tipped his hat again, mounting his horse with the ease of a man who belonged to the saddle. "Good night, And just like that, He was gone, hoofbeats fading into the prairie twilight. Clara stood rooted on the porch, staring at the horizon long after he disappeared. For the first time in weeks, she felt something stir in her chest, small and fragile. Hope. But hope, in the Wild West, could break a heart faster than grief.
The storm rolled in from the west, black clouds churning like smoke from a furnace. Thunder rattled the hills, and rain swept across the prairie in heavy sheets. By nightfall, the Dawson farm was lashed with wind that rattled windows and banged shutters loose. Clara sat by the small kitchen table, a lantern flickering weakly against the storm's fury. Bills and bank notices lay scattered before her, the ink smudged from her trembling fingers. Tears blurred her vision, but she blinked them away, whispering, I can't do this alone. Her body ached from carrying the child, her heart from carrying her grief. The storm outside felt like a reflection of the storm within, relentless, unforgiving. A knock thundered at the door. Clara startled, clutching her belly instinctively. Who would come in such weather? She hesitated, then pulled the door open against the howl of wind. And there he stood, Daniel Holt. His hat dripped rain, his coat soaked through, but his eyes were steady, lit by the lantern's glow. He removed his hat respectfully. Storm's bad. I figured you might need a hand. For a moment, she just stared, too weary to speak. Then, stepping aside, she allowed him in. Daniel's presence filled the room, tall, broad, solid like a wall against the chaos outside. He set his hat on the table, glanced at the bills, then at her. She flushed, embarrassed to have her struggles laid bare. You shouldn't have come, she said softly, brushing at her damp hair. I'll manage. He studied her for a long moment. Then, his voice low but unshakable, he said, Clara, you're not managing. You're fightin' a war alone. The words cut straight to the truth. Her breath caught, tears threatening again. What choice do I have? She whispered. Jacob's gone. The farm's dyin'. And she pressed her hand against her swollen belly. I've got this child comin' with no father to raise it. I don't know what to do, Daniel. I just don't. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the roar of rain on the roof. Then Daniel stepped forward, close enough that she could see the stormlight glint in his eyes. You've got a choice, he said, voice firm. Clara looked up at him, confused. What do you mean? Daniel drew a breath, as though steadying himself for words he'd held back for too long. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched, then finally, the dam broke. Clara, I've watched you suffer. I've seen you carry more weight than any woman should. And I can't stand by any longer. Her lips parted, but no sound came. His eyes locked on hers, fierce and unwavering. Your child will need a father. And I want a family. The room seemed to still, as if even the storm outside hushed to hear the words. Clara's heart hammered. The line cut through her despair like a blade, sharp, startling, undeniable. Her hand flew to her mouth. Daniel, no. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly, he said firmly. I've lived alone too long. My house is quiet, my table empty. Every night, I hear the wind howl, and I know there's nothing waitin' for me when I walk through the door. That ain't a life. Not the kind I want. I don't want land or cattle to be the only things with my name on 'em. I want a wife. I want a child. I want a home. Her eyes filled with tears. But this child, it isn't yours. It will always be Jacob's. Daniel's face softened, but his voice didn't waver. I know. And I'd never take Jacob's place in your heart. But I can take his place in your child's life. I can give him my name. my protection, my love. And you, he paused, his voice trembling just slightly. You don't have to be alone anymore. Clara's knees nearly gave out. She gripped the edge of the table for strength. Her heart warred with itself, loyalty to Jacob's memory, fear of what the town would say, and yet, that flicker of hope she'd buried deep. Daniel, I can't. I don't know if I could love again, she whispered. He stepped closer, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the rain on his coat. His hand hovered near hers, not touching, but close. Then don't think about love. Not yet. Think about survival. Think about that baby. Think about a roof over your head, food on the table, and a man beside you who won't walk away. Love, he swallowed. Love will come in its own time. But right now, you need more than memories to carry you. Her tears spilled freely now, streaking her cheeks. She wanted to run, to hide, to pretend she didn't need him. But the truth was laid bare, she did. She couldn't do it alone. Slowly, trembling, she placed her hand into his rough, calloused palm. Yes, she whispered, voice breaking. Yes, Daniel. I'll marry you. Relief flickered across his face, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself a small, rare smile. He wrapped his other hand around hers, holding her as though anchoring her against the storm itself. The thunder rolled again, but inside that little farmhouse, something had shifted. Two broken lives, bound now not by passion alone, but by need, by courage, and by the promise of a new beginning. That night, as the storm raged outside, Clara Dawson found shelter not only in her walls, but in Daniel Holt's vow. And for the first time since Jacob's death, she dared to believe tomorrow might hold more than grief. The wedding was simple, quiet, and without fanfare. In a small wooden chapel on the edge of Dry Creek, Clara Dawson, dressed in a plain blue dress, stood beside Daniel Holt, the rancher who had offered her more than she thought she deserved. The preacher's words were brief, but steady. No church bells rang, no town gathering filled the pews. Just a handful of neighbors attended, some whispering behind their hands, others watching with cautious respect. Strange match, one woman murmured. A widow, carry in another man's child, and Holt talking her anyway. Daniel heard them, but his jaw tightened, unbothered. He had never cared for gossip. Clara, though, felt each whisper like a needle. She kept her chin high, even as her cheeks burned. When the preacher asked if Daniel would take this woman, child and all, Daniel answered with a firm, unwavering voice. I will. And when Clara's turn came, her voice shook, but she managed to say the same. The rings were plain bands of silver. When the preacher declared them man and wife, Daniel reached for her hand and squeezed it, not with passion or flourish, but with a quiet strength that said more than words ever could. For Clara, it was not the wedding she had once dreamed of. But it was the beginning of something she had not dared to hope for: safety. A future. Life as husband and wife did not come easy. Daniel was a man of few words, and Clara still grieved Jacob in the quiet hours of the night. Sometimes she woke from dreams calling for her late husband, only to find Daniel awake, sitting by the window, pretending not to hear. Other times, she caught him watching her with an expression she could not read, as if he was waiting for something she wasn't ready to give. Yet, slowly, a rhythm formed. Daniel repaired the fences, fixed the roof, and brought in cattle from his own ranch to fill the Dawson pastures. Clara tended the garden, cooked meals, and prepared for the child's arrival. Their days were filled with labor, their nights with silence, broken only by the wind across the prairie. And in that silence, something new began to grow. One evening, Clara watched Daniel carry a broken wagon wheel to the barn. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, his arms straining with strength earned from years of toil. For the first time, she noticed not just the man who had stepped in to save her, but the man himself, quiet, dependable, steady as the land. A different kind of love than Jacob's, but love all the same. The town still whispered. Some called Daniel a fool, others pitied Clara. But in time, their words faded. What remained was a woman who no longer walked with her head bowed, and a man who, after years of loneliness, returned each night to a home filled with warmth. Then came the night of the birth. Winter winds rattled the farmhouse, and snow fell thick across the prairie. Clara labored for hours, her cries echoing through the wooden walls. A midwife worked by lamplight, her hands quick and steady. Daniel waited outside the room, pacing the floorboards, every nerve in his body stretched tight. He had faced cattle stampedes, storms, even gunmen on the trail, but nothing had made him feel so helpless as hearing Clara's pain. At last, the cry of a newborn pierced the air. Daniel froze, his breath caught in his chest. The midwife appeared at the door, smiling wearily. "It's a boy." Daniel's legs nearly gave out. He stepped into the room, his eyes falling on Clara, pale and exhausted but alive, cradling a tiny bundle in her arms. The baby's cries softened as she rocked him, whispering through tears. Daniel moved closer, kneeling beside the bed. Clara lifted the child, placing him into Daniel's rough, calloused hands. For a moment, the rancher who had lived his life alone stared down at the tiny life before him, fragile and new. The baby's eyes fluttered open, and Daniel felt something shift inside him, something fierce, protective, eternal. His throat tightened as he whispered, almost to himself, "You've got a father now, son, and a home." Clara watched him, tears spilling down her cheeks. In that moment, she knew this man was not Jacob, nor would he ever replace him. But Daniel Holt had given her what she thought she had lost forever, a future. She reached for his hand, and he clasped it, their child cradled between them. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the Dawson farmhouse, a different kind of storm had ended. The storm of loneliness. The storm of despair. And in its place was something new, fragile, but strong. A family. From that day on, the whispers in town no longer mattered. The prairie stretched wide and endless, but in the Dawson home, 3 lives were bound together beneath the same roof, beneath the same sky. And though the Wild West was harsh, Clara and Daniel had found what few ever did in such a land, not just survival, but love born of loss, and hope carried into the future by the cry of a newborn child. Spring came slowly to the prairie. The snows melted, rivers swelled, and wildflowers stretched across the hills like a quilt of color stitched by God himself. The land that once felt empty now seemed alive, whispering promises of renewal. At the Dawson farm, the air no longer carried silence, but the sounds of life. Chickens clucked in the yard, cattle lowed in the pastures, and within the farmhouse walls, the soft coos and cries of a newborn boy filled the rooms. Clara rocked the child by the window, sunlight spilling over his small face. She traced his features, the soft curve of his nose, the delicate curl of his fist, and felt tears sting her eyes. There was Jacob in him, yes, but there was also something new. Something that belonged to this new life she was building with Daniel. She turned as the door creaked open. Daniel stepped in, brushing dust from his hat, his broad frame filling the doorway. He paused, watching her with the baby, his eyes carrying the same look he'd had the night he made his vow, steady, unshaken. "How's he doin'?" Daniel asked quietly. Clara smiled. "Strong. Hungry. Loud." Daniel chuckled softly, a rare sound, deep and warm. He crossed the room, placing a gentle hand on the child's head before meeting Clara's eyes. For a long moment, they said nothing. They didn't need to. The town's whispers had not ceased entirely. Some still called Daniel a fool, others pitied Clara. But in the face of gossip and doubt, their home had become a fortress of its own. Not built of stone or timber, but of resilience, shared labor, and the quiet bond that had taken root between them. One evening, weeks later, Clara stepped outside, while Daniel worked mending the corral. She held the baby close, the sky burning gold with sunset. She watched Daniel lift heavy posts with ease, his movements steady, practiced. The baby stirred, and she whispered softly, almost to herself, "You've got a good father, little one. Better than I could have prayed for." The words caught in her throat, because she realized she meant them. Jacob's memory would never fade, his love still lived in her heart. But Daniel had given her something Jacob no longer could, a future. Seasons passed, and the farm slowly came alive again. With Daniel's cattle grazing in the pastures and Clara's care in the gardens, the Dawson place, once on the brink of ruin, began to thrive. Neighbors noticed. Some who had doubted now tipped their hats in respect. Children from nearby farms came to play by the creek. And in church on Sundays, Clara no longer sat alone. She sat beside Daniel, their son resting in her arms, a family carved not from perfection, but from loss, courage, and second chances. One night, after putting the child to sleep, Clara stepped onto the porch. The prairie stretched before her, wide and endless under the stars. She remembered the nights after Jacob's death, how she had sat in that very spot, staring into the dark, wondering how she would survive. Now she felt Daniel's arm slip gently around her shoulders. She leaned against him, her body no longer trembling with fear, but steady with quiet strength. The stars above shimmered, vast and eternal. Clara spoke softly, her voice carrying across the night. "I thought my story ended when Jacob died. But maybe it was only just beginning." Daniel tightened his arm around her. "Sometimes life don't give us the story we expect, but it gives us the one we need." She turned to him, her eyes glistening in the starlight. "Thank you, Daniel, for giving me back more than I thought I'd ever have." He didn't answer with words. He simply held her closer, his silence speaking louder than anything else could. And in that moment, under the endless western sky, Clara Dawson, once a grieving widow, knew she had found not just shelter, not just survival, but a true home. The prairies stretched on, wild and unforgiving. But for Clara, Daniel, and the child in their arms, it no longer felt empty. It felt full. Full of second chances. Full of hope. Full of family.